If the 90s was the true decade of Linux, then the 2000s was the decade of the derivatives. A decade filled with taking the older stalwart distributions of Linux and spinning them into something that refined them. The Linux veterans were mostly fine with refining what they had internally, but a batch of newcomers wanted progress. And progress, however fast or slow, is never quick enough or in the right direction for some. So, from Debian, there was Ubuntu. From Red Hat, there was Fedora. From Slackware, there was Slacks. And from SUSE, there were about 7 different ways to write and pronounce SUSE. Now, looking around the Linux landscape with a GPL here and an MIT license there, an odd feeling arises that this derivation process never really stopped. And that feeling would be right. There's a new distribution popping up every week, it seems. Some out of frustration, some out of love, and some out of practicality. One might also notice that to support all this Linuxing, blogs, forums, and help sites are everywhere. And that's really where this story begins. At a place called linuxforums.org. Built around 2002 on the 2-year-old at the time tried and true PHP BB forum software, it was obviously for users of Linux. New, old, admins and otherwise, all were welcome. Over the next 3 years, it had its ups and downs, but gathered quite a following until it was handed off to new ownership at the end of 2005. Before the turn of the year, a call for writers that would author articles on Linux at $300 for a couple thousand words showed up on the site and garnered the interest of a developer by the name of Clement Lefebvre, who we'll just call Clem. After writing a few articles for Linux forums, Clem decided that hosting some of these articles himself, rather than letting Linux forums have all the fun, would be in his best interest. But a name. You have to have a good name. Something cool. Fresh. Maybe like some type of mint? And with that, LinuxMint.com was born. A place for cool and fresh articles about Linux. And while the articles did well, it was the distribution tinkering that Clem was writing about that really got people talking. The distribution was Ubuntu, Clem's favorite at the time, twisting it, turning it, and adding value to it. Now, whether you remember this or not, Ubuntu, when it started, took the freedom stance very seriously. And before the patent expired, MP3s were a contentious topic in Linux. Could a distribution support MP3 out of the box? Should they? What would Stallman think? Some Linuxes at the time did support MP3 out of the box, though, like PC Linux OS, but most didn't, including Ubuntu. Of course, that made Clem's how to add MP3 support to your Linux distribution very, very popular. There were others, too. Did you know that widescreen monitors were tricky to get working at the time? The square aspect ratio was king, and that meant you had to get down in the weeds to wrangle X to support anything that wasn't square by hand. May Xenia help you if you didn't make backups of your configuration. The article did quite well too. In less than a year, though, all of these fixes, recommendations, and tweaks that could have been defaults, Clem saw another opportunity, but certainly one he never intended. The calls for a distro that just included this stuff were getting louder and louder, and he was in a unique position to provide one. Soon after picking up the pen, efforts were split between articles and a new distro release of LinuxMint.com. Based on Kubuntu, the KDE 3 flavor of Ubuntu. It supported the two big wants, media compatibility and widescreen capabilities. It also shipped with a new look. Clem said about the look and feel.
One of the major differences between Kubuntu and Linux Mint is the artwork. In Mint, the idea is to use the most popular pieces of artwork from kdelook.org and fit them together in a nice and consistent way.
Out in August of 2006, this would be version 1.0 beta, codenamed Ada. 3 months later, Kubuntu and the KDE 3 desktop were dropped in favor of Ubuntu and the GNOME 2 desktop. Version 2.0 of Linux Mint was released in November with the codename Barbara. And like its upstream Ubuntu, the alphabetical progression of codename releases was set. 2.0 also added more quality of life improvements with the addition of Flash, Java, and Real Player installed by default, and the Amarok media player as opposed to Rhythmbox, the default at the time. With B version 2.1, the next month, defaults that are still present today begin to show up, like an IRC client that connects automatically to Linux Mint channels for easy support, and a Firefox feature that allows going back a page by using the backspace key. This feature was quite prominent in other OSs at the time. Bianca version 2.2 showed up early in 2007 with a KDE and Lite edition to satisfy folks on the forums asking for alternatives. And Clem said of the versions,
"The first version had no goals at all. It was something I experimented with. After that, feedback shaped versions 2.0, 2.1, and 2.2. It's only after Linux Mint 2.2, Bianca, that things got serious. The biggest goal for me is to make sure each release is the best release to date. It might sound funny, but it's not always easy to achieve. Things move fast upstream. Technologies change. My main concern is to continue to provide to people what they like and to get closer to a better desktop, to make it easier and more pleasant to use each time."
And Cassandra, version 3.0, followed up over May and June with an additional XFCE version 2. Mint also continued its commitment to fully functioning by including Windows NTFS support to ease the transition to Linux and help those in multi-OS situations. Software, wobbly windows, and other niceties were the hallmark of Mint. Selena 3.1 followed up with a Mint-maintained Firefox package and Mint's very own package manager, apt, which is not the same as the apt-you-know, and 4.0, Darina, and a website revamp was released before the year was out. One of the controversial changes in 4.0 was the update stability ranking system that left kernel patches out of the mix to prioritize a working system. And while it certainly achieved a working system more often than not, dissatisfaction with the foregoing of security by default would begin to bubble up here. And talk of a Debian edition had been popping up here and there, and by the end of the year, it was nearly ready. Clem said,
"We started with the Debian edition. The first reason was to show that the technology we developed is distinct from the upstream components it sits on top of. The second reason is simply that we did try most alternative components and that our selection was driven and justified by the tests we made. We do not plan to make our own base and do not plan to change our base to Debian or Fedora, but experimenting with these new bases will give us a better appreciation of the pros and cons related to using Ubuntu and eventually a better idea of what can be achieved in the long term or in case Ubuntu goes towards a direction we do not want to follow."
Elisa, version 5, with no minor versions to follow, was released in mid-2008 and was the first time a long-time support release was marked. 3 years of never having to upgrade. It was a shift to long-term stability rather than innovation. And with that, Elisa would be boring, including the new Fluxbox edition. Felicia at 6, Gloria at 7, and Helena at 8 were all released between the end of 2008 and early 2010. An LXDE version showed up at this point too. A new long-term support release at 9 with Isadora beginning in late 2010, and 2 releases followed with Julia at 10 and Katya at 11 in mid-2011, with a Linux Mint Debian edition nestled in between it all. Underneath the surface, though, conversation had already started about what to do about the new GNOME 3. It wasn't moving in the direction that Linux Mint saw itself wanting to go, and Ubuntu, its upstream, had already been making plans to move to Unity in their next release. In the short term, GNOME 3 would be adopted, but made minty by the addition of the Mint GNOME Shell extensions, or MGSE. It allowed disablement, so a normal GNOME 3 session could be had, but without going that extra step, it would be mint as usual with a few visual cues that anything was really different. Mate would also be available in the upcoming release as a fallback and continuation of everything Mint built without too much compromise. Lisa, version 12, with these two desktop options, was released in November.
Some people don't understand how important GNOME was for us. It was by far the most popular and most mature desktop environment. It was a huge component for us. We have a vision, and no matter what happens, we get things done. Linux Mint 12 was hugely impacted, and it shipped with an early version of Mate and set of GNOME shell extensions, which roughly did the job, but weren't any long-term solution.
And so the story of Cinnamon begins at the end of 2011. GNOME 2 was dead. Mate filled the gaps, but there was no denying that the future was GNOME 3. Such is the life of a developer that relies on a major component living upstream. But a vision is a vision, and that meant forward progress. The work that went into the shell extensions would lead the way into Cinnamon development. With testing done on version 12, that meant that Linux Mint 13, a fresh new long-term support release, would be the first recipient of Cinnamon out of the box. Maya, version 13, was released in May 2012.
I'll probably always have fond memories of Linux Mint 13 as it marks the end of the drama and the recovery from the loss of GNOME for us. Maya is also my daughter's name, so that adds to it even more.
With that release, Linux Mint became much more than a good Linux distro with sane defaults and a great experience. There was really no denying it before, even though many tried, but Linux Mint was now an entire operating system. Developing the tools it needed regardless of what upstream did, making things portable so other bases could use them, making highly opinionated decisions on behalf of its users. Not every step was a good one, but forward Mint marched, now with Cinnamon and Mate at its side. And forward meant change. More of it. Moving to a GNOME 3 base meant taking a lot of the changes that GNOME made and keeping them, changing them, or outright starting over. Cinnamon has always been a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. Nemo was no different. Forked from Nautilus, GNOME's file manager, it was announced in September and quickly added back many of the features that were missing in the switch from GNOME 2 to GNOME 3's Nautilus. Over the next year, Cinnamon and Nemo continued to receive more and more features to catch up to GNOME. And while not all users of the OS liked this tumultuous time, some leaving for greener pastures, no one could say that things weren't getting better. Reviews in Linux Format magazine heralding it as the best distro of 2012. Lifehacker, TechRadar, and Linux User and Developer gave glowing reviews, and blog post after forum post backed all the hype up. Around this time, only Ubuntu proper seemed to have more inertia. Starting in late 2012, Nadia at version 14, Olivia at 15, and Petra at 16 came and went, each with an updated Ubuntu base and related improvements, which all came out by the end of 2013. So while 2.0 was getting backported to the previous releases, in April of 2014, Cinnamon 2.2 was released in preparation for the upcoming release of Linux Mint. Better settings, power management, hot corners, high DPI, and tablet support were just some of the many updates in this cycle. The first Mint in the 17 line was Kiana, and it came with that Cinnamon 2.2. This meant better edge tiling, snapping, and came with easily configurable sound effects. Nemo also got an uplift in performance. Displays were easier to adjust, and the system tray was packed with information. It would eventually be backported to Petra and even Maya, the previous LTS. Now, version 17 was a big departure from the versioning up until now. No longer would Mint follow every release of Ubuntu. Instead, Mint's major revision would coincide with Ubuntu's long-term support release every 2 years. The point releases afterward would roughly and inadvertently coincide with Ubuntu's point releases, but would really target changes within Mint and Cinnamon rather than within Ubuntu.
The decision was made to stick to the LTS bases. In other words, the development team will be focused on the very same package base used by Linux Mint 17 for the next 2 years. It will also be trivial to upgrade from version 17 to 17.1, then 17.2, and so on. Important applications will be backported, and we expect this change to boost the pace of our development and reduce the amount of regressions in each new Linux Mint release.
After Kiana, though, Q names were hard to come by, so Rebecca, Rafaela, and Rosa were chosen instead. Later in 2014, Cinnamon 2.4 was released with better memory management, responsiveness, and Nemo got custom icons and emblems. To underscore the growing popularity of Mint and Cinnamon, calls at the end of 2014 for switching from the main repository to a mirror grew louder and louder. Otherwise, your chance for a timeout during update was quite high. The next year in June, Cinnamon 2.6 was released with better multi-monitor support, more screensaver option panel improvements, more intuitive settings, and some accessibility improvements. Nemo got a plugin manager and a better file operation display. In November, Cinnamon 2.8 gained a power applet to show battery life of all batteries attached to the system, a more informative sound applet, and a preview when hovering over an application on the panel, something Windows 7 had had for quite a while. Nemo got a quick rename, which is a way to rename files by clicking on them. Another Windows-esque improvement. In the run-up to the Linux Mint 18 releases in late February 2016, the Linux Mint domain was attacked and had tainted ISO links added to the download section of the site. This didn't affect wary users that used torrents, or even those that used a direct HTTP link to the ISO files, but those that happened to click on the Cinnamon Edition link on the site around that time. The issue was quickly cleaned up, processes were changed, but, oh boy, the news remained. Looking ahead though, the focus was again on version 18 and a new fixation on XApps. GNOME was moving in a different direction again, but the link between Cinnamon and its GNOME counterpart was solid. In 17, applications were downgraded to prevent them from breaking during upgrades of GNOME upstream, patched, or just replaced with alternatives from the Mate or XFCE world. Those were temporary solutions though. XApps was the future. Apps written by the Mint team for everything.
The idea of working on apps which would be generic, perfectly suited to run in both Cinnamon, Mate, and XFCE, and possibly other desktop environments made more sense. It's an idea we've had for a while. With the start of a new Mint 18.x series, the timing was right to get this project started. XApps will be a collection of generic GTK3 applications using traditional interfaces which can be used as default desktop components in Cinnamon, Mate, and XFCE.
A few months later, Cinnamon 3.0 was released, targeted to Mint 18 based on Ubuntu 16.04, with better touchpad support, more animations, and better window management. This would also come with a new theme that, for Mint users, was a bit of a shock, as noted by Clem. The theme was flat, which would modernize the look and feel of Mint and Cinnamon. This included some new icons. At the end of June, Linux Mint 18 Sarah was released. Serena, Sonia, and Sylvia were to follow. In September, a new website dedicated to hosting all the plugins that Cinnamon could use called Spices was announced and noted some of the newer features that would land in Cinnamon 3.2 for the Serena release. When it dropped in November, it included vertical panel support, a cleaned-up menu, and some eye candy. For Sonia, Cinnamon 3.4 with better icon management on the desktop, and came with improvements that stabilized Cinnamon and made it much easier to continue that work by separating out processes so issues can be fixed easier. For Sylvia, Cinnamon 3.6 with better account integration, touchpad compatibility, a Cinnamon Spices revamp, and a better on-screen keyboard. This was also the release that brought a revamped software manager and Flatpak to the Mint ecosystem, and enabled FlatHub by default, making applications previously unavailable present and ready to install. The next big leap would be on a new Ubuntu base in 2018, and came with a much welcome and needed change to the updating of Mint systems. With the introduction of a backup and rollback software named Timeshift in 18.3, but solidified in Mint 19, codenamed Terra, released in June, the Mint team could relax their "don't break anything" requirement and felt safe opening up and pushing all updates to the system. And this included even the kernel updates that previously might have broke something. Linux Mint 19 also marked the death of the KDE edition, which allowed the devs to focus solely on the GTK side of things and better support the remaining Cinnamon, Mate, and XFCE desktops. Cinnamon at 3.8 brought performance, faster file search, and the ability to amplify sound over 100%. Starting at the end of 2018, the next few releases of Mint, Tessa, Tina, and Trisha all came with their respective version bumps of Cinnamon, with Tessa getting the major version bump of Cinnamon 4.0. Another wild change appeared in the form of a panel revamp. No longer would it take the Windows 95 to Windows XP style traditional panel, but a slightly more modern Windows 7 style metaphor with icon-only style shortcuts across the panel with window previews to differentiate instances of the same application. It would take some getting used to for some loyal Mint fans, but as the Mint team does, there's always a way to take a step back and take the older, beaten path. Mint also gained the ability to switch kernels, and X-apps were coming along nicely. In August of 2019, Tina made its debut with improvements to Mint like better update manager that helps you keep track of support, and a system report tool to get help. Cinnamon 4.2 saw greater performance boosts in the overall desktop, menus, and even got built-in Samba support. Trisha in December saw Nemo and panel improvements in Cinnamon 4.4, and Mint got a system troubleshooter and even better high DPI support. In the later half of 19's development, the Snaps distribution model made a big splash on the Ubuntu side by making it the only way to get Chromium. It would no longer be available as a deb. This started a chain reaction downstream in Mint that would eventually block Snaps altogether.
As you install apt updates, Snap becomes a requirement for you to continue to use Chromium and installs itself behind your back. This breaks one of the major worries many people had when Snap was announced and a promise from its developers that it would never replace apt.
In 2020, Linux Mint 20, codenamed Uliana, was released in June based on Ubuntu's 20.04 and started a trend that continues today. A look at how Linux Mint can contribute to the wider Linux ecosystem. More than it already was, I mean. So applications that were easily portable were starting to show up, like Warpinator, an application to send files from one Linux machine to another. It just needed someone to take it and package it up wherever it needs to be. This was sucked up by FlatHub pretty quickly. There was also support for NVIDIA Optimus. Cinnamon 4.6 came along for the ride and introduced fractional scaling. Ulissa brought another couple of applications in January of 2021 called Web Apps and Hypnotics. Web Apps did what Firefox no longer wanted to, PWAs, or Progressive Web Apps. In other words, your web-only application can be a button for your desktop and run in its own little container. Nifty. Hypnotics is an online TV player. Cinnamon 4.8 brought faster rendering at higher resolutions, better spices support, and better searching in the menu. Uma in July featured Cinnamon 5.0 with multi-layer searching in Nemo. You can even use regular expressions. As always, performance bumps and the ability to better manage spices. And while Linux aficionados do their real file renaming in the terminal, an application called Bulk File Renamer shows up to do the same job on the desktop. Warpinator also found its way to Android, and the Update Manager in Mint gained the ability to update the entire list of spices, Flatpaks, and regular packages all in one. Una, in January of 2022, brought the weirdly named Thingy to manage your reading and keeps track of your progress and sticky notes for the desktop. But most importantly, Cinnamon 5.2 with its focus on the calendar in the panel. It now shows lots of visual information and integrates with things like Google Calendar. Linux Mint 21, named Vanessa, released in July of 2022, is based on Ubuntu 22.04 the long-term support release, and keeps the slow, steady pace of Linux Mint and Cinnamon development moving forward, all with a shiny new base. Mint got some slight improvements all around, but Cinnamon 5.4 got a major rebase as a result of the new system base. Most of the underpinning software like Muffin had been updated to be almost at parity with upstream. This necessitated a new display settings window. Older themes no longer worked, and a generally crisp look and feel all around. The real changes start soon. Vera in December brought Cinnamon 5.6, and 5.6 brought the corner bar. Down at the bottom right edge by default, it replaces the Show Desktop button traditionally on most panels, but also has a few configurable tricks up its sleeve too. And Nemo, when highlighting, only highlights names without darkening the icons too, along with a few other visual cues to help readability. Mint got itself a new mouse cursor and an updated look with color. Victoria in July of 2023 brought better visibility in menus and an updated software manager, while Cinnamon 5.8 got a new style picker that simplifies theming down to 1 or 2 clicks. Notifications now support the selected accent color too, and touchpad gestures are built right in. Virginia at the beginning of 2024 brings Cinnamon 6, and with it introduces the new type of cinnamon spice called Action. These were available in Nemo but are now exposed further. They're typically found in the right-click menu and can be things like verify an ISO with its hash. 6.0 brought rudimentary Wayland support, and Mint saw most of its work done in its applications. With a new LTS Ubuntu 24.04 released, it's time for a major revision of Linux Mint 2. Version 22, named Wilma, brought more localization and translation. The introduction of Matrix as the previously used IRC client had gone unmaintained for quite some time. Rather than revive it, the Mint team decided Matrix was a much more modern way to connect and get help. Not that the IRC went away, mind you. Cinnamon 6.2 got some simple updates by the way of a menu editor to control all of the actions introduced in the previous version of Mint.
Outside of Mint, Cinnamon looks pretty ugly.
So, Cinnamon 6.4 will end up with a much-needed facelift. And moving forward, X-apps will get a lot more attention, so they're available easily outside of Cinnamon and the Linux Mint ecosystem. Advait will really get a run for its money.
You can catch all the great topics as they unfold on our Lemmy subreddit or news channel on Discord. If you want all the great links, you can go to Linux user space /Lemmy, Reddit, Discord, Mastodon, Telegram, Matrix, Twitch, Twitter. You get the idea. It's all there.
That's linuxuserspace.show.
That's right. linuxuserspace.show/Lemmy/Reddit/Discord.
All the
you
things.
know, they're there. And if you get confused, just go to linuxuserspace.show. There's links on the top where you can click on them, and it'll take you to the magic place.